Welcome to the Intuitive Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Rafferty, medical doctor, PhD, Reiki and shamanic intuitive healer. I'm here to bring you on a journey of holistic healing that explores the science of the physical body combined with mental and emotional well-being, energetic and spiritual health. And I'm so excited to have you guys join us today because I'm having a chat with Monica Wilde, or Mo Wilde, as some folks in the foraging community like to call you. And I'm so grateful that you're taking the time to come and chat with us. Thank you so much, Mo.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's lovely to be with you this afternoon.
So, just a little bit of a background, I suppose, to how I found you. So, obviously, I'm obsessed with the gut microbiome. I'm obsessed with plant-based diversity in the diet, and I've read a lot about the research on the Hadza tribes in Tanzania. They're kind of one of the, I suppose, remaining hunter-gatherer tribes that exist in the world, and the research that's been done in their gut microbiomes that's showing that there are species of bug that exist in the guts of these hunter-gatherers that have a predominantly kind of plant-based or plant-dominant diet, and they eat seasonally in some ways, isn't it? That they've ended up with this kind of beautiful diversity, and there's bugs that exist in their gut that they don't see within more industrialized populations. And I was looking through Instagram. Obviously, I have so much stuff to do with gut health popping up on my screen. And the Wild Biome Project came up on my Instagram. And I immediately started clicking in. And I became completely fascinated looking down through the work that you're doing. And I know that you've finished one Wild Biome Project and you're launching a second one early next year, I believe, is it? So I was so fascinated to get you on to have a little chat to you about kind of your journey to get here so far, what inspired you to do the Wild Biome Project, if you could fill us in on what that is. And yeah, tell us a little bit about what's happening next year.
Gosh, well, what inspired me? I think stubbornness inspired me. And I was certainly, if you go back and read all my report cards from when I was a kid, there are things that say, Monica should just accept instruction. In other words, don't ask too many questions. And I started off by eating only wild food for a whole year. And that really came out of answering the question that many people on my foraging courses would ask me, which was, well, it's all very well telling us you can eat this and you can eat that and you can get sticky woolly seeds or cleavers seeds and toast them up and make coffee. But I mean, when would you really do that? And could you really live on wild food? I mean, could you live on wild food for a year? And I didn't know the answer to that question. And simultaneously, I'm a research herbalist. I have a master's degree in herbal medicine, finally. And, so I also see patients and spend a lot of time talking with them about diet and nutrition. And there's so many different diets around now. And when people would talk about the paleo diet, because of my interest in foraging, and also because I was brought up in East Africa, you mentioned the Hadza. I was brought up in East Africa. And it didn't always seem quite right to me what a lot of people were saying about paleo. And I thought, well, the only way to really know what our ancestors were eating in Scotland 12,000 years ago is to give it a go. So that was kind of how I got to eat wild just for a year in the first place. And because I've got this, because I'm this blend of, science and art and intuition and, determinedly scientific as well, I set out during the year of also then doing gut microbiome samples. So before, at the beginning, and then every time, I didn't have enough to do them every month, enough money to do them every month, but I did them every time the food changed. So that was about every 3 months and ended up with 6 samples. And my friend Matt, who I'd roped into eating wild for a year with me, because it's just so much easier when there are 2 people, he came up and he did the tests as well. And at the end of it, it was like, well, this is really interesting, but what does it all mean? And I reached out to the scientific community and was looking to pay somebody for a professional opinion. I wasn't expecting anybody to do stuff for nothing. But nobody wanted to have, to give me an opinion about what on earth was going on. I mean, at the lab, they'd said, oh, we don't normally see results like this moving around up and down and species coming and going like that, unless people are doing lots of probiotics. But I couldn't get anybody to take any interest because at the end of the day, really, we were just two nutters. And there was no control group and no, not enough people. And it was just all a bit too off the wall. So I realized that if I was going to ever get an opinion and get anyone to take this seriously, I was going to have to basically run it as a type of trial. And when I did my master's degree in herbal medicine, eventually when I was 50, we were taught how to design clinical trials. So I set out to do it very properly and methodically and, ethically as well, and managed to convince 24 people, myself included, 23 other people, mainly from the Association of Foragers, who are other people who teach foraging. So at least they kind of knew what they could pick and eat, to do this project. So that was how it all started.
Wow. It's just so fascinating. Like, I love that it was driven by passion and an inspiration to know more. And that's what makes the greatest science, isn't it, really? When it comes from a fire in your belly to be like, actually, I've seen some changes here. I want to know what the crack is. And I suppose it's so tricky in some senses. I'm still involved in research that does microbiome related work. We look at the gut and the vaginal microbiome. And I suppose there's still so much that's unknown about how the bugs relate to each other in a community sense rather than just them being in isolation. And that's, I suppose, a shortcoming of the testing in a lot of ways. Like, did you see much of a difference over the course of the year that you initially did it by yourself? There was big shifts in the bugs.
Yes, I did. And I would have actually loved to have tested at least once a month, and I would very much like to test against the introduction of specific foods, because I think a lot of them are quite food specific, the way that they behaved. And there's been very limited trials on mushrooms and seaweeds in particular, but also nettle in a in vivo study that shows that even single plants or single fungi can significantly influence gut microbiome. And yeah, and I think for me, the reason it was important also is that, like, in Europe, or particularly I would say in the UK and Ireland, a lot of people think that foraging's a wee bit of a faddy, yuppie sort of thing to do. A bit middle class, a bit chefy, a bit yuppie, and who'd really want to be eating that unless it's, the gourmet side of it. And what people forget is that wild food is still depended on by at least 50% of the world's population. And in areas, of war, poverty, and all the rest of it, up to 70% of people still rely on wild food for a large part of their diet. So, I mean, there was a paper that came out showing that in Syria, during the civil war conflict in Syria, there was a 62% rise in people foraging. Of
Isn't
course,
that amazing?
you know,
Oh, yeah.
Russians, when they, besieged some of the Ukrainian towns and villages, put landmines in the forests where they went foraging for mushrooms. And, there's so much talk at the moment about food security. What are we going to eat in severe climate, with a lot of climate change? What are we going to eat when intensive agriculture as much as intensive animal farming proves not to be the answer, because we're degrading the soil to such an extent. What are we going to eat if, the Russians go crazy and nuke us all, or somebody, terrorists take out the grid, or water becomes a really precious resource? And
Yeah.
if we had to go back to eating famine foods in this country, and most of the forage foods are called famine foods, what would be the effect on our body? Because we don't know. We
Yeah.
really don't know. Well, when people ate famine foods in the past, were they starving? What was the effect on their bodies? Did it just keep them alive, or did they flourish on it? And this year, we finally, I think, it's that sort of perseverance. Finally, having done the year and done this study with the 24, and we've got 120 people taking part next spring. And we finally now got a scientific partner with the University of Bradford School of Archaeological and Forensic Science, a wonderful team there. And they study the isotopes from bones and hair and teeth, and try to determine what people were eating, in Stone Age times and Bronze Age time, but also during famine periods, during the Middle Ages, and indeed, they've done a lot of work on, people during the Irish potato famine. Mm-hmm. So they're going to be looking at, well, are some of the incredible results that we've seen, for example, with weight loss, where people who were classified as obese lost weight at a better rate than Ozempic, and also learned much more about how to eat and didn't have those side effects. Was that a healthy weight loss, or were they actually starving? So that will be very interesting. And you'd mentioned the Hadza earlier, and that is very interesting research, and they do have a very different microbiome to that in the West, but that might just be partly because they're in the southern hemisphere. And not because they have a wild diet and we have a civilized diet. And, I thought about this a lot, because earlier this year I went and spent just over a month, 5 weeks, living in the Kalahari Desert with a Jutransi tribe and looking at what they were eating. And there is this massive discrepancy between what they should be eating and what they are, because they've been caught in that economic cleft of dispossession from their indigenous lands, and yet not being on the economic ladder too.
Wow.
And everything's very upside down in the southern hemisphere in terms of forage foods. There are far more fibrous roots, for example, than there are here. We have far more leafy stuff. So, and again, that was really inspired by the fact that I wasn't really going to understand how those people live unless I actually pitched up and went to live in a little straw hut.
That is absolutely fascinating. Like, wow, that's amazing. But it's amazing your observation about, this kind of connection to the land that they still have, but this kind of this shift away from the truly indigenous ways in which they're living. It's kind of like they're caught between a rock and a hard place almost, that they can't quite eat the foods that were native to their original diet. And we've seen within the Western world how wild it has gone with regard to how foods are processed. And even when people come through, what their perception of what something that's good for their body actually is completely skewed. And even when I was driving home last night, my mind was blown, because all the ads on the radio within a 5-minute drive, it was just blowing my mind about what the media was telling you was good for you. And I was like, God, this is like subliminal brainwashing through the media, away from actually our connection to the land, our connection to herbs, our connection to what Mother Earth has provided us with that can sustain life, And I was quite fascinated hearing about what you were saying there about the individual things like seaweeds and mushrooms. And I think it's phenomenal in loads of ways that there's kind of an acknowledgement now about the medicinal qualities of these beautiful plants or herbs, and it's just so it's amazing to hear you say, actually, we need to look at in-person studies about how individual kind of plants are affecting people. And even as part of the fertility protocols, through Trevor Wing over in the UK, Chinese herbal medicine, he uses a lot of mushroom protocols actually for his fertility clients. And I love speaking to herbalists about this kind of work, because I think we've lost touch a lot with the original medicine, you
Yes.
know. And we're just dominated by the pharmaceutical industries. People will immediately go to the GP to get a prescription, but why aren't they going to see their herbalist to get what has been around for so much longer, you know?
I think this is also partly because with mainstream medicine, it's gone down this reductionist route to try to isolate, okay, what is the one compound we can match to one symptom,
Hmm.
and the clinical trial that does that. But in all of this standardization of, taking herbs and mushrooms and taking out the active element and concentrating it and making an exact dose so that you know exactly what's happening in people, we forget that there's something we can't standardize, and that's people.
Mm.
I
Yes,
mean, if you
yes.
got, 10 women and stood them in a row and they all weighed 70 kilos, you would have an incredible array of heights and shapes and sizes, even though the common denominator was 70 kilos, for example.
Yeah.
And, one thing that I noticed when, we did the study with 24 people, and I'll be looking out for in this larger study with 120, is that some people adapted very quickly and much more easily than others. And the ones that seem to have the most challenging sort of crossover onto the wild diet tended to be the Vata types, whereas the Kapha types went over to it like a duck to water. Now,
Mm.
that might have just been because the Kapha types tended to have, more body fat reserves in the first place, and Vata types have less body fat reserves. But, I will be, looking at that a lot more closely this time, because I'm also aware that, different people come to these with different genetic heritage and probably different gut microbiome types as well. I mean, wouldn't it be interesting if we found that there were clearly, different microbiome types between these, different groups?
Yeah, that would be fascinating. And just for the listeners listening, when you're speaking about the Vata and the Kapha, you're speaking of the Ayurvedic body
I am.
types essentially. Just for anybody that's listening, that's interested to read about those different kind of definitions, I suppose, isn't
Yes,
it?
they're called the doshas or
Yes,
doshas
yeah, it's
definition.
quite
In
fascinating.
in more recent Western terminology, that would have been mesomorph, endomorph, and ectomorph. These different types.
The different
And
body
we
types.
saw that. I mean, even when I did the study over the year with just myself and Matthew, um, he's a very skinny, scrawny type, um, and but has diabetes because of his Indian ancestry, and I'm a very generously proportioned, closer to the earth type, very much a Kapha, um, with a family history of lipedema. So, very, very quickly um, run, to carrying excess weight. And, the diet, was good for both of us, but our gut microbiome sometimes went off and did entirely their own thing.
Mm.
So it was quite difficult to tell what was really happening. And in the second study, where we worked with the Zoe Health Project, and they had defined 50 good bacteria and 50 bad bacteria. I think they've now got 100 good and 100 bad. Not that the bacteria in themselves are really good and bad, but what they said the good ones was the ones that they tended to find in people who appeared to be healthy, and the bad bacteria, the ones that tended to be more predominant in people who weren't. Um, and what was interesting was that some of the so-called bad bacteria actually increased inversely to people's blood sugar coming down. When I think of, Matthews, it was coming down. And then we had other anomalies as well. We had one of the participants who had been born and brought up in Eastern Europe, but has been living over here for a long time. Incredibly healthy, according to all the, the body metrics and measurements, and all of the blood tests for cholesterol and blood sugar and things like that. Very, very healthy. Had always eaten lots and lots of fermented foods, and a mainly plant-based diet, and had no good bacteria.
Wow.
Not one, no good bacteria at all. And this is because this person's coming from another culture.
Yes.
But the things that we did notice were that sometimes during the seasons, and this was, again, going back to Matt and I looking over the seasons, and again, just two results, unfortunately, was that sometimes there'd be a bacteria which you could clearly link, for instance, to a food or something happening. So I'm thinking specifically of Oxalobacter formigenes, which we know, and it's, the clues in the name as well, Oxalobacter breaks down oxalic acid. And mine was sort of quite low, and then going into the first 3 months of the spring, when you're eating a lot of young dock and dock stems and sorrel and lots of other plants that are quite high in oxalic acid, in me this bacteria increased by like 1100%, and then it calmed down during the summer. And then in November, it started coming up again. Well, November is when pink purslane comes out, and you're back to eating a lot of pink purslane and sorrel. So for me, that seemed to be a direct correlation between plants that were very high in oxalic acid and my body going, hey, we need to have some more of this because we need to break down all these oxalates. If
Is that
only it was so simple
fascinating?
to look at all of them individually, though.
Yeah. God, that is fascinating. I love the attention to detail that you had to be able to be like, actually, these are all the different things. These are the components, and even your knowledge of the herb essentially that you were eating to be like, this contains X, Y, Z, and this is the bug that can break this dominant compound down.
If
Like,
I had an unlimited budget, there would be a lot of different tests going on. But it's, when you're doing citizen science, it's so hard to fund this work.
absolutely. And uh, I've spoken into this in previous episodes as well with regard to the American Gut Project, and they were a citizen science project as well. And when I read on your website that you were doing a citizen science project, I was like, oh, this is amazing. Like, I love that approach to doing research, it's so tricky. Like after going through academia and working, doing a lot of kind of clinical trial management and all of these things, like the publication bias and even what gets through ethics and all of these things, it's just so real, and it's so sad actually a lot of the time as well, because a lot of really good and projects or people who are very passionate about the type of work, it can be hard to get it through to even just the starting block, and I think what you've touched on there with the Zoe project, it's amazing to see what's coming out of King's College with their Zoe devices that they use and the project that they've been running. And just their kind of drive towards individualized nutrition in some ways to kind of understand it. Do you feel like after what you did kind of and seeing with your own eyes what happened over the space of time, that we're hitting the nail on the head with what they're approaching things with? Or how do you find it kind of tied into your journey?
It's a difficult one because with the wild food, we had more questions thrown up than we had answers, certainly.
Mm.
And I think also, looking back at the person I just mentioned with Eastern Europe, um, it may well be that because Zoe isn't funded for participants, that the people who can afford to do that may come from a particular socioeconomic class or a certain section of society that's not necessarily fully culturally representative. And
Mm.
that may throw up some questions that they might discover as the study broadens. But they've got a lot of data there. So I don't
Yeah.
question for 1 minute that for the population that they're serving, that this is, probably helpful. I
Mm.
can't really comment. I've not followed it that closely. Um, and certainly the principle, I think Tim recommends that everyone should eat 30 species of plant a week. I mean, I found that on average, if you go for a wee walk and gather a salad, you're eating around 40 just in a bowl of salad.
Yeah.
But I think that for the participants who were experienced in foraging longer, it ended up being about 55 species a week was what was naturally being gathered.
Isn't that amazing? Like I very much appreciate this kind of drive for understanding nutrition on a deeper, more individual level with regard to the research that Tim Spector is doing and the projects over in King's College. Um, but it is quite fascinating from speaking to people who have actually done the actual the journey with them with regard to what they're flagging as being foods that interact well with their microbiome versus things that don't, you know. But it is interesting, this kind of topic of the 30 plant points. And it's quite fascinating to me because when some clients come through the door and I'm like, well, what does plant diversity look like for you in your diet? And when I send them home, there's the majority of people are eating less than 10
Mm.
different types of plant in a week. And, you know, the guidelines for kind of 30 plus grams of fiber is needed per day. Like when I was looking through the research in the Hadza tribes, they were eating upwards of over 150 grams of fiber. And it's so wild how we've moved so much away from this kind of diversity. Like you were saying, you could be having over 50 different types of plants, of herb in your diet every week, to just this handful of carrots, broccoli, tomatoes from the shop. And even I do wonder a lot about how we grow these things these days. What is the nutritional content of what we're actually buying in the shop like nowadays versus kind of what you can grow at home if people have the opportunity to do that? Or what's the soil quality like you were mentioning, you know?
But even vegetables that you grow at home don't have the fiber content than what the Hadza and the Dutrazi are eating. I
Yeah.
can guarantee you that. And even if you start to eat dandelion root and burdock root and um, things like marsh, I'm just about to dig up some marsh woundwort tubers tomorrow. They've got so much more fiber, and it wasn't just fiber from plants as well. You know, the Hadza and the Dutrazi, they do also eat meat, um, but obviously it's hunted, not farmed. So it's a very different type of meat. It's not high fat. It's very lean, and they use every part of the animal. So there's a lot of fiber coming from eating, sinew and tendon, in that too.
Yeah.
Um, so it's, but I think it's what's most interesting is the loss of the micronutrients if you don't have a wide variety of plants. I think it was, if you look at something like turmeric now, they've analyzed, it's been very, very well researched. It's got hundreds of compounds. I think the last time I looked, it was getting on towards about 500 different compounds when you looked at James Duke's research. Bless him, he's passed away. But, even if you just said that each plant species had 10 unique micronutrients, for instance, And in the year that I ate only wild food, I ate 300 different species of plants.
Wow.
So that's possibly 30,000 unique micronutrients that I ate that nobody who was eating from a supermarket got. And I sometimes wonder about this because I got very interested in longevity because my great gran lived to be 103. My granny was 99, died just a little shortly before her 100th. And nearly everybody in my family lives to be a ripe old age. And I did some research some years ago trying to think, well, is there a common diet or a common thing that they're doing? And really the only thing that was common about their diet was that it was pretty local and natural. Some ate meat, some didn't, some ate lots of carbs, some didn't. Most of them carried on, getting quite a bit of exercise. But at the end of all the studies, almost like a little PS, there was like, oh, and by the way, most of them went out and gathered wild herbs for medicinal teas and stuff like that. And I was like, that is where the common thing is.
Mm.
It's all of these extra little herbs and things that are going in and that are tweaking your health all of the time.
Oh, it's amazing, isn't it? The power, the absolute power that these herbs have to just transform health. It's
Yes, because farming
phenomenal.
only gives you calories.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it's quite fascinating because I was reading through the results of that you have on the website of the Wild Biome Project, and you saw like quite significant changes in people. Can you speak into kind of on a physical health point of view, kind of what you saw in some of your results? Now you've touched on kind of the change in the HbA1c with your friend's diabetes risk, and you mentioned weight as well. You really did see quite fascinating changes, didn't you?
Yes. Well, certainly with HbA1c, which is the measure for diabetes, um, you saw it coming down. I mean, Matt was the only diabetic, but his reversed completely. But when you looked at other people who had, who weren't pre-diabetic or diabetic, you still saw their HbA1c drop a couple of points. So people who were at 39 would drop down to 37, or someone who was 37 would drop down to 35. So there was this modifying effect on blood sugar that was starting to creep up towards I think the cutoff's 41, isn't it?
42, yeah. Oh, yeah, the upper end of 41. Yes, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so you saw that, people who were sort of hovering around the high 30s, that would come down. You saw an incredible normalization of blood pressure. There were a lot of people with very high blood pressure, and you saw that come down. But you also saw some people who had slightly low blood pressure, and you saw that come up. And it was
That's
quite
fascinating.
interesting because I actually produced a scatter graph to look at the before and after of it. And you could see there was this sort of spread out cluster going to the sort of two extremes. And then on the second scatter graph, everything was sort of normalized towards the same place. And that kind of didn't surprise me because I did some work many years ago now with the University of Glasgow Medical School looking at iodine in seaweed. And we had, I think it was about 20, it's about 50 participants aged around 25, taking 500 milligrams of dried powdered seaweed for a couple of weeks. And you saw that as well, because you saw the people who had, you know, were going up towards sort of the hypothyroid benchmark, sort of coming down, but nobody dropped out at the bottom. Everything sort of normalized. And this is this is the power of plants, really, because we forget that they are such experts in balance. And it makes total sense because if you think about it, if you were planted in the ground suddenly overnight and could never go anywhere, you couldn't run off to a gated community if there was trouble. You couldn't run for it. So it's in your absolute interest as a plant or a tree to make sure that the environment around you stays as balanced and calm and as in balance and as healthy as possible. And they are constantly monitoring the environment. Every cell on the outside of a tree has the equivalent of a nose that's taking in, all of the phytochemicals that trees and plants put out in the air. Everything that we can smell is really a chemical message, and they're taking them in and responding. And they know when, if you take hawthorn for high blood pressure, it tends to normalize it. It's only if you do a massive overdose of standardized cretaceous that you'll take it too low. Do you know what I mean? It's that
Yeah.
really lovely balancing, normalizing effect.
Well, it's quite fascinating. I literally was only discussing this with a client today who's been on a significant fertility journey, and they do these specialized bloods, looking at, they call them Chicago bloods. They're looking at all these different inflammatory markers. There's other bloods that people have gone off and done, looking at their leukocyte content, the white blood cells, and all of these things. And when people come into me and there's evidence of inflammation in the body, I'm kind of saying to them, what is the diet and the lifestyle looking like? What is the diversity in the diet like? Are you eating herbs? Are you eating the diversity of plants that will bring things back into a state of homeostasis or balance, rather than going out and looking for the medicines to kind of bring something into balance? The body knows what to do when you give it the right tools,
Yeah,
and I love to hear that, when you're kind of talking about this kind of reaching, kind of coming back to this beautiful state of equilibrium, more so than driving it off the other end.
yeah.
It's
And
really so amazing.
weight loss was a important thing. I mean, it was statistically significant. And in even people who only did it for 4 weeks, managed to lose quite a considerable amount of weight. And then, but those people who were already quite slim or thin to start with, didn't correspondingly lose too much either. They would often lose a couple of kilos, but nothing like the same volume.
Mm.
And so I've just got just sort of looking at the figures now. People who were obese lost on average 16% of their body weight over 3 months.
Wow.
Which is quite a considerable amount. It was an average of 5.6 kilos.
Yeah.
And some lost, considerably more. And people who were just overweight, by BMI standards, lost an average of just under 15%, lost an average of 4 kilos.
Wow.
And even in 1 month, people would lose an average of 9.25% of their body weight, except
Uh,
for those who didn't need to lose it.
yes. Wow. Isn't that amazing? So it was just bringing things again back into a state of equilibrium.
Yeah.
And so, can you tell me a little bit about what the dietary, I suppose, intervention looked like? Did everybody just go straight into eating just only foraged foods for the whole time, or was it in addition to some of the like foods that they were eating beforehand?
Yes, no, everybody could only eat foraged foods. Now, in order to get the study numbers up, we had to accept people who live in towns who had that experience. And that was a little bit more difficult because they don't always have the same access to land, access to countryside. And so where they couldn't, we had to make exceptions. So if people hadn't, they were also joining the project quite late. So if people hadn't already collected enough hazelnuts, for example, which was a primary food in the British Isles, they could buy a certain amount of organic hazelnuts. Or if they couldn't go fishing, they could buy locally caught, fresh, locally caught fish from a fishmonger that was local to them. But eggs, we couldn't eat birds' eggs because wild birds' eggs, it's illegal and they need all the help they can get. So there was this system whereby if you saw a bird's nest, you could look up what bird it was, see the size of their eggs, and substitute an organic chicken's egg for it.
Okay.
So there were a few of these sort of small tweaks just to make it possible to do it. And of course, the trouble is, once you sort of impose some guidelines, particularly when you have people who are foragers who tend to be very neurodiverse, or they all would have ended up with office jobs. And as soon as you set up guidelines, people want to push against them. Like, well, and what about this? Do you consider wild fuchsia berries that have not been planted for people to eat? Or what about the Japanese knotweed that the builder dumped by the side of the road that's producing, these lovely rhubarby-like shoots? Do those count as wild foods? And of course, wild is not, wild's a continuum in the same way that health is a continuum between, life at one end and death at the other. And we're all sort of hovering somewhere in between. Wild is a continuum between wild and feral and stewarded and shepherded and tinkered with and cultivated and produced in a laboratory.
Yes, yeah.
So
It's and is it all just native species of plant that you were working with?
predominantly,
Yeah,
but if somebody was foraging in a town and there was a park and there was some wild cornelian cherry or something, we would say yes, okay.
yeah.
But you couldn't go into an orchard where somebody deliberately planted fruit. But
Okay.
if somebody had a long hedge of Oregon grape or something and was producing this tiny little sour black berries that nobody else, you go along and you're picking them and somebody will come up and go, do you know those are poisonous? um, so if they were, really, if they'd been wild elsewhere, so that's what I would call feral, escapees. But
Yes, yeah.
predominantly 95% of it, if not more, was native indigenous species, yes.
And so you mentioned people could go fishing, and were people hunting for game and things like that, or what way did it work for the meat intake? You were speaking a little bit about the paleo kind of views that people thought that people like the Hadza tribe had previously, and now that you've kind of lived in community with tribes, what does it look like to eat meat?
Yes, I mean the Duke Clancy are very preoccupied by meat and hunting and where it's going to come from. And basically, as you totally know, and probably most of your listeners already know, that the body is a bit like a dual fuel car. It's either fueled by carbohydrate or it's fueled by fat. And in the wild food landscape of the British Isles, there's not a massive amount of carbohydrate. And you'd really notice this when you go to somewhere like the Kalahari. In the Kalahari, you'd be walking along through a very arid, sandy landscape, and below a thorn bush, somebody would suddenly spy a tiny little creeper, a little tendril of a vine, maybe only 2 or 3 inches high, curling around the bottom of a shady tree. And they'd leap forward with a digging stick and dig down and suddenly produce a tuber the size of a baby.
Wow.
And that would be chopped up and everybody would have a piece. Literally the size of a baby. And you don't get those here. Because in the Kalahari, in Tanzania, where the Hadzane are, you have this, great shortage of water, which means that plants need to store water and carbs, sugar in the form of carbohydrate, for very, very long periods, sometimes 6 months or more, or sometimes even years before the rains come again, in order to sustain life so they can shoot again. We have completely the reverse here. We have more rain than we want, and consequently, most of the roots don't swell to a large size. They are thin and they're wiry and they're gripping onto rocks and roots so they don't get swamped out and swept away. But we do have very, very lush green growth. And so, that's where a lot of the fiber would come from, but it doesn't give you a massive amount of carbs.
Mm.
So our real carb intake was during the autumn months when there were lots of berries, and where we got the opportunity to gather lots and lots of nuts. And the hazelnut harvest, certainly in Scotland, when you look at archaeological digs and all the middens and things, was really important. But if you think of it, by the time people got to the end of the winter or February, most of the carbohydrates that they had gathered were running out. And even when we were eating grass grains, which is another sort of a paleo myth, the fact that we didn't eat grain until agriculture, we were eating grain 730,000 years ago, according to the
Wow.
archaeological evidence. It just wasn't one strain of fattened wheat. It was, a multiplicity of wild grasses. But we would have been driven in sort of February, early February, down to the coast where the seaweeds were and the shellfish, because there would have been very little else to eat. And then, we'd have gone through that season, and then the land plants would have started to produce greens and things. There would have been birds' eggs. We could have moved inland again. But then come the summer, you've got a period of hunger again, because the plants around you are, in the spring, they've brought their energy up from the underground, from the roots and the tubers, and they've brought it into the leaves, and you've got these amazing tasting, fresh, wonderful leaves. But in summer, they're all doing flowers, and there ain't no calories in flowers. And then they're doing seed. And then eventually in the autumn, the energy goes into fruit, as in berries, and back down into the earth to swell the roots that are there. So we would have had these, and it wasn't just about diversity in terms of per week, it's diversity throughout the year.
Yes, yeah.
At the end of the summer is when you harvest grain and you store it because it's really good at storing, and then you eat it over the winter. But there's a natural gluten-free period from about, February, and you'd probably have used up the last of the flour making pancakes before the big fast. And then you wouldn't have actually been able to get any till the end of the year because it's a seed. So if people come into the clinic and say, well, I've had Weetabix for breakfast every day, and I've had sandwich for lunch every day, and I've had pasta for supper every day, and I've done this 365 days a year for the last sort of 30 years, and I think I'm gluten intolerant. It's like, well, no, no surprises there. Because we're supposed to have variety through the seasons. Well, that's my opinion anyway.
Yes, yeah. And that's the thing, the way we kind of the way we eat these days, we do have a lot of people, a lot of clients that I see, they have set things that they like to eat. Some people are even like, on Mondays I eat this, on Tuesdays I eat this, and on Wednesdays I eat this. And that's the same every single week. That the diversity, the seasonal diversity isn't there. You're so right.
Mm.
And so as you move now into the new project that's starting, it's April 2025, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. And have you tweaked anything, or what's that looking like now as your next adventure kind of takes off?
Well, it's difficult at the moment because we've not got full funding. So we're doing
Okay.
a lot of crowdfunding. And, I'll happily give you a link at the end to plug everybody out there.
Absolutely.
Help us do this because we do need your help. So we're testing the gut microbiome again, and we're also doing the blood sugar and cholesterol. That was one thing which wasn't very clear in the first trial because about three quarters of people's cholesterol came down, but a quarter of people didn't, and some of them even went up a little bit. So it wasn't clear. There was no statistically significant direction in what was happening with cholesterol. HSCRP, inflammation, that was really interesting. We'll be testing that again because we saw it come down. So we're doing the same tests, but in addition to that, we're also taking people's hair. We're cutting off hair. We're not shaving. We're just small bits, about 12 strands at a time. And that's going to be analysed at the University of Bradford, looking at the isotopes. And we're collecting lots and lots of plant material and even dehydrating some of the meals and things like that in order for them to be able to carbon isotope, well, not just carbon isotopes, I think there's nitrogen and sulfur, different isotopes of all of these, to try to start to see that relationship. But more importantly, one of the difficult things the first time round, and I'm learning all the time, was trying to get everybody to keep a really clear diet diary of what they were eating. Some people were really happy to be quite, geeky and put it all in a spreadsheet and go like that. Some people were trying to reassemble it from their Instagram photos at the end of it. And it was very difficult to get a really clear view of exactly what they were eating. So this time we're doing it a little differently. Over the last 20 years, I've been collecting loads and loads of papers and getting access to databases and things, but really mainly individual papers where things have been tested. Not necessarily for human consumption. A lot of it's been, looking at it as a possibility for animal feed, or it's in other countries. But we've assembled this database of all the macronutrients and many of the micronutrients in these wild foods. Cool. And we've created an app that's going to be ready next month in time for the project. So everybody's going to be able to track this. And that means that we'll be able to see, what their protein, fat, fiber intake is daily. And then we'll also have this really big body of standardized data at the end of it from 120 participants.
Isn't
what
that
I'll
phenomenal?
do with all that data, because
I love it.
Statistics and data is not my, I've learned how to do the student t-test, but
yes, the bane of everybody's existence.
Yeah, with that amount of data, I'm really hoping. I mean, I'm certainly the University of Bradford are really, really interested, and at least it will be there.
Yeah. Oh, it's going to be really, really rich data, and it's something that's not being done at this level within kind of westernized societies, and I'm just so excited to see what comes out of it.
And when you have that detail, you're able to look at things like, for instance, okay, what were people consuming the most of, and should we grow that with crops? What about a farming of the future where instead of eliminating all of the weeds and just killing everything off with, herbicide, why don't we actually grow some of these weeds as nutritional, vegetables? Why are we importing, vegetables in from other countries where we've taken the land away from other people? I mean, the Jutlansi not eating their traditional diet is because they don't have access to the land that they used to inhabit.
Yes. Yeah.
And, we in the West, we are incredibly privileged, but we're, living that way on the backs of the indigenous people elsewhere. So to find local foods that give us all of the nutrition that we need, that we can grow easily and diversify farming here, that would be a really fascinating thing to come out of this data. And with the University of Bradford and their commitment to working with me on this for the next 5 years, wow, we're then going to do another wild biome test in the autumn of 2026, because that will then take you into a different season where the consumption is, nuts and berries and mushrooms, as opposed to, greens and seafood and eggs. And we're just going to keep on doing it till we know what's going on.
Oh, I love it. I'm fully supportive of this. And for anybody listening that is so curious now about foraging, because like you've really given me anyway as a listener a flavor for just wanting to get out there and actually people don't realize, like I'm always foraging through. We've had some lovely gardens here at the practice. And I love doing nettle tea and getting my dandelions and doing all my bits and pieces. And people don't realize you can actually go out into your garden, into the nature, and collect these things. For someone listening that this is so new to, where can people start foraging? Where can you learn to forage? You know?
Well, there's a variety. There's a variety of ways. It is by far the easiest to learn from someone who already knows.
Yes.
So to go out with somebody, and depending on where you live, if you live in a country area, there may well be some little old lady or little old man that you often see in a hedge with a basket. Stop and talk to them and ask what they're doing, and get to know that. Back in 2015, I think it was, I helped to found an organization called the Association of Foragers, which has a website as well. And that is a group of people, about 160 people teaching foraging in and around, Britain and Ireland and a little bit overseas as well. And they're people who are teaching courses, because it's much easier when you can see something. So if I gave you a botanical book, and there's very good books and you can learn to key things out in books, but if I gave you a botanical book and I described two round green things about the size of a baseball with overlapping leaves and a nice crunchy core, and the leaves were slightly wavy, and I would be describing a lettuce and a cabbage. But it might take you quite a long time to visualize this and to think what they were, and be like, oh, it's really confusing. How am I ever going to tell the difference? But you know the difference between a lettuce and a cabbage.
Yes. Yeah.
So you have the mental power to tell one thing apart from the other. So I suggest to people that you try and find people to learn from directly. If not, there are lots of good books out there. What you do need to do is to avoid the ones generated by AI, because there's a lot of those. But again, if you go to something like the Association of Foragers website and look up the members, most of them have written a book, and any of those would be recommended.
A good place to
They're
start.
genuine people, and I think is that not a good advice for anything you're looking at? If you're
Yes.
reading an article about any aspect of health or the environment or anything, look at who wrote it and look them up and see, if they have the credentials and the authority to really write about something. And then just add in one new thing a week.
One
Maybe on
new
a
thing a
Monday,
week.
add one new species a week, and just think about it, concentrate on that one, go out, find it, look at it, maybe cook a little with it. By the end of 2 years, that's 100 species.
Yes. Yes, I love that. I absolutely love it. Well, Mo, thank you so much for coming on. It's been so fascinating to hear all about the work that you're doing, and I'm just so intrigued to follow you and see how everything goes with the next stage of the journey. So, for folks that are listening, we'll pop in a little link to the Wild Biome Project in the show notes, and also a link if you'd like to donate to the research that's being done. This amazing work. It's just in the show notes, so definitely check it all out. And hopefully, Mo, we'll have you back on in the future after you've done the next stage of the investigation to tell us all about what you've found.
Yes, and we'll be starting on the 1st of April, and everybody will be, no doubt, putting what they're eating on social media. So everybody's very welcome to sort of follow along and see what's happening. And just remember, foraging is ultimately the most local way of getting your food. It has 0 food miles. It's always fresh,
Mm,
and and it brings you into a relationship of gratitude with the land that we need. That we
yes,
so need to work on our relationship with nature, because, as with any relationship, it flourishes when you spend time. And
yes,
only by having that caring and loving type of relationship are we going to get out of the mess that we're in.
yes. Oh, that is an absolutely beautiful note to finish on. And I really love this kind of reconnection with nature. And as you tend to the land tends to us, you know. So it's a beautiful place to
It's a
finish.
true
Thank you
wild
so much,
country.
Mo. Thank you so much. It's been such a gift to have you on, and best of luck with the journey moving ahead.